Growth isn't about adding more. It's about removing what's false. There's a peculiar tragedy in watching someone become successful while slowly disappearing. You've seen it, perhaps even lived it. The promotion comes, the accolades accumulate, the Instagram feed glows with achievement, and yet somewhere beneath the polished surface, something vital is dying. You look in the mirror and wonder when you stopped recognizing yourself. When did your life become a performance you can't stop giving? We've been sold a magnificent lie about growth. We've been told that becoming who we're meant to be requires addition, more skills, more achievements, more credentials, more self-improvement. We stack identities like armor, believing that each new layer brings us closer to our authentic self. But what if the reverse is true? What if everything you've been adding has been burying who you actually are? Consider the marble sculptor standing before a block of stone. Michelangelo once said that he didn't create his sculptures, he simply removed everything that wasn't David. The masterpiece was already there, imprisoned in rock, waiting to be freed. What if you are that sculpture? What if your true self isn't something you need to construct, but something you need to excavate? What if growth isn't about becoming more, but about becoming less? Less false, less borrowed, less pretended. This is the uncomfortable truth that Jung spent his life exploring, that philosophy has whispered through the ages, and that your own exhaustion has been trying to tell you. The person you're working so hard to become might be the very thing preventing you from discovering who you already are. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Sarah. Objectively, Sarah had achieved everything. Harvard MBA, VP at a tech company, married to a successful architect, 2 children in private school, a home in the right neighborhood, friends who looked perfect in group photos. She had become exactly what she set out to become. And yet at 42, she found herself sitting in her car in the parking garage before work, unable to turn off the engine, unable to go inside, unable to explain to herself why success felt like suffocation. Sarah's therapist asked her a simple question: "Who are you when no one's watching?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer and realized she had no idea. Every response that came to mind was a role, a title, a relationship to someone else: mother, executive, wife, daughter, alumna, professional. But underneath all those labels, who was she? The question haunted her because beneath it lay a more terrifying realization. She had spent 20 years becoming someone and couldn't remember deciding to become that person. This is the invisible crisis of our age. We're drowning in options for who we could become while simultaneously losing touch with who we are. The self-help industry offers us countless paths to transformation: meditation apps, productivity systems, morning routines, personality frameworks, leadership courses. And we consume them hungrily, believing that the next course, the next certification, the next breakthrough will finally complete us. We're constantly adding, acquiring, accumulating. More tools, more techniques, more identities to try on. But here's the paradox Jung understood deeply. The more we add to ourselves, the further we drift from ourselves. Each new technique, each adopted belief system, each borrowed identity becomes another layer of paint over the original canvas. We mistake the accumulation of personas for personal growth. We confuse the expansion of our resume with the expansion of our consciousness. Think about how this manifests in your own life. You read a book about stoicism and start trying to be stoic. You learn about vulnerability and attempt to be vulnerable in the prescribed ways. You study successful people and adopt their morning routines, their productivity hacks, their ways of speaking and thinking. Each edition feels like progress, like self-improvement, like becoming. But underneath, there's often a growing sense of fragmentation, a feeling of playing roles rather than living authentically. The problem deepens when we realize that many of these additions aren't even chosen, they're absorbed. From childhood, we learn which parts of ourselves are acceptable and which must be hidden. The boy who loves art learns to love sports instead. The girl with challenging questions learns to become agreeable. The sensitive soul learns to appear tough. The wildness in us learns to sit still, to be quiet, to be good. And we call this process maturation, growing up, becoming civilized. But what if we've mistaken domestication for development? What if the process we call becoming an adult has actually been a gradual betrayal of the self we were born to be? We don't notice it happening. It's incremental, seemingly necessary. We tell ourselves we're adapting, being practical, growing up. But underneath, something genuine is being buried alive. The great philosopher Kierkegaard wrote about the despair of wanting to be oneself, and the despair of not wanting to be oneself. He understood that most people live in a third state, the despair of not knowing there's a self to be at all. We're so busy constructing ourselves according to external blueprints that we never discover the blueprint written into our own nature. You feel this as exhaustion, as the nagging sense that you're living someone else's life, as the quiet voice that whispers during insomnia that everything you've built is built on sand, as the strange grief that accompanies achievement, the emptiness that follows success. You feel it in the way certain compliments feel hollow, in the way praise for the persona feels like an indictment of the person underneath. This is the modern condition. We're overstuffed and undernourished, overlayered and underdeveloped, incredibly busy becoming someone we're not sure we want to be. And the solution isn't to add more. It isn't another framework, another system, another path to follow. The solution is something far more radical and far more terrifying. Carl Jung understood something that most of his contemporaries missed. The unconscious isn't just a repository of repressed memories and primitive desires. It's also the keeper of the unlived life, the guardian of the authentic self we abandoned in order to become acceptable to the world. Jung called the process of recovering this lost wholeness individuation, and it remains one of the most misunderstood concepts in psychology. Individuation isn't self-improvement. It's not about becoming better or more evolved. It's about becoming whole, which often means becoming less palatable, less convenient, less easy to categorize. The individuating person isn't climbing towards some idealized version of themselves. They're descending into themselves, excavating the buried material, reclaiming what was exiled. At the center of this process is what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear, the social interface we present to the world. The word persona comes from the Latin for the masks worn by actors in Greek theater. It was a necessary tool for performance, for playing a role. And Jung insisted that the persona is necessary. We need these social masks to function in society. The tragedy occurs when we mistake the mask for our face, when the persona becomes our entire identity. Think of the persona as a kind of psychological clothing. You need different clothes for different situations, professional attire for work, casual wear for home, formal dress for occasions. The problem emerges when you forget you're wearing clothes at all, when you believe the suit is your skin. This is the crisis Sarah faced in that parking garage. She had so thoroughly become her personas that she'd forgotten there was anyone underneath them. But the persona is only half the equation. For Jung, whatever doesn't fit into the persona, whatever is unacceptable, inconvenient, or contrary to the image we're maintaining, gets pushed into what he called the shadow. The shadow is everything we've decided we're not. It's the repository of the disowned self, the qualities and characteristics we've exiled from consciousness. And here's what's crucial to understand. The shadow isn't just our dark side or our moral failings. It contains everything we've repressed, including positive qualities that didn't fit our persona. The person who had to be tough to survive might have a shadow full of tenderness. The person who learned to be helpful might have a shadow full of healthy selfishness. The person who became rational and controlled might have a shadow full of passion and spontaneity. Jung insisted that we cannot individuate, cannot become whole, without integrating the shadow. This doesn't mean acting out every repressed impulse. It means acknowledging, accepting, and reclaiming the disowned parts of ourselves. It means having the courage to see ourselves completely, without the flattering filter of the persona. Shadow work isn't comfortable. When you begin to see what you've been hiding from yourself, there's often shame, resistance, denial. You've spent years constructing an identity, and the shadow threatens that construction. But Jung observed that the shadow, when brought into consciousness, becomes an incredible source of energy and vitality. All that life force you've been using to repress parts of yourself becomes available for actual living. There's a beautiful and terrifying principle in Jungian psychology called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite when pushed to an extreme. When we try too hard to be only one thing, we unconsciously cultivate its opposite. The person who tries desperately to be good becomes haunted by evil impulses. The person who maintains perfect control faces sudden eruptions of chaos. Jung saw this pattern everywhere, in individual psyches, in cultures, in history itself. This is why growth through addition eventually fails. When you keep adding idealized qualities to your persona while repressing their opposites, you create an increasingly unstable psychological system. The pressure builds, the shadow grows more powerful in its exile. Eventually, something breaks a depression, an anxiety attack, a seemingly irrational crisis, a sudden implosion of the life you've carefully constructed. Jung called these moments psychological deaths, and he understood them as necessary. The old structures have to break down for individuation to occur. The persona has to crack for the authentic self to emerge. This is why midlife crises are so common after decades of becoming who we thought we should be. The psyche rebels. The shadow demands recognition. The unlived life demands to be lived. But Jung also offered hope. He understood that this breaking down isn't failure. It's the beginning of real psychological growth. What looks like falling apart is actually the false structures crumbling so the true self can emerge. The task isn't to repair the persona, to rebuild the mask. The task is to meet what's underneath, to face what you've been fleeing, to reclaim what you've disowned. The process Jung described involves active engagement with the unconscious, through dreams, through imagination, through paying attention to what triggers you, what you project onto others, what you resist most strongly in yourself. It's detective work, but the mystery you're solving is yourself. Every strong reaction, every inexplicable mood, every person you intensely dislike is a clue pointing toward your shadow material. And at the center of all this, Jung saw what he called the self, not the ego, not the conscious personality, but the totality of the psyche, the organizing principle of wholeness. The self is what you're uncovering when you remove the false. It's not something you create or become. It's what you are when you stop pretending to be something else. The journey of individuation is the journey from persona to self, from the constructed identity to the authentic totality. It's not a path of addition but of revelation, not of becoming but of uncovering. The philosophers have been circling this same truth for millennia, each approaching it from different angles, but all pointing toward the same essential insight. Authenticity requires subtraction, not addition. Nietzsche understood this profoundly. His call to become who you are wasn't an invitation to construct an identity. It was a challenge to excavate one. Nietzsche wrote about the eternal return, the thought experiment that asks, if you had to live your exact life over and over for eternity, would you embrace it? Not the life you wish you had, not the life you're performing for others, but the life you're actually living. The question reveals the distance between who we are and who we're pretending to be. Nietzsche also spoke of the spirit's three metamorphoses: the camel, the lion, and the child. The camel carries the heavy burdens of society's expectations and inherited values. The lion rebels against these burdens, roaring, "I will," against the world's "thou shalt." But it's the child who represents the final transformation, innocent, creative, playing, creating new values not in reaction to the old, but from an authentic spontaneity. This is growth through removal, shedding the camel's burdens, transcending the lion's reactive rebellion, arriving at the child's original freedom. In Eastern philosophy, this principle is even more explicit. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, effortless action, isn't about doing nothing. It's about removing the artificial striving, the ego-driven forcing, to allow natural action to emerge. The Tao Te Ching tells us that in pursuit of knowledge, every day something is added. In pursuit of the way, every day something is dropped. The sage becomes powerful not through accumulation, but through subtraction, returning to simplicity, recovering original nature. Buddhism goes further still, suggesting that the self we're so busy constructing is itself an illusion, a source of suffering. The Buddhist path isn't about building a better ego, but about seeing through the ego's constructions entirely. Enlightenment isn't achieved by becoming something greater, but by removing the false identifications that obscure our true nature. The Buddha's awakening came not from adding wisdom, but from removing ignorance. Existentialist philosophers like Heidegger spoke of authenticity versus das Man, the anonymous they. That dictates how one should live. Most people live as they live, think as they think, want as they want. Authentic existence requires stripping away these inherited, unexamined ways of being to face the anxiety and freedom of choosing oneself. But this choosing isn't selecting from a menu of possible identities. It's acknowledging what you already are beneath all the social conditioning. Sartre, despite his famous claim that existence precedes essence, understood that we spend most of our lives in bad faith, lying to ourselves about our freedom, pretending we're fixed things rather than beings constantly creating ourselves through choice. But this self-creation happens through rejection and negation as much as through affirmation. We define ourselves by what we refuse to be, what we strip away, what we leave behind. Even ancient Greek philosophy recognized this. The Delphic maxim, "Know thyself," wasn't an invitation to introspection as modern self-help understands it. It was a reminder of human limitation, a call to see clearly without the distortions of pride or delusion. Socrates spent his life removing false knowledge, showing people that what they thought they knew was actually layers of unexamined assumption. His method was purely subtractive, taking away false certainty to reveal underlying ignorance, which was itself the beginning of wisdom. Martin Buber wrote about the I, thou, relationship versus the I, it, relationship. We relate to the world and others as objects to be used, manipulated, understood, as its. But in rare moments, we encounter another as a thou. In pure presence without agenda or objectification. This transformation of relationship can't be forced or constructed. It emerges when we drop our usual ways of relating, when we remove the barriers we've erected between ourselves and reality. The medieval mystic Meister Eckhart spoke of Gelassen, height releasement, letting be, a kind of radical non-attachment that isn't indifference but a profound opening achieved through letting go. Eckhart understood that God, or ultimate reality, couldn't be found through accumulation of knowledge or spiritual practices, but through a process he described as becoming empty. So that divine presence could flow through, the shell must be cracked apart if what is in it is to come out. He wrote, "For if you want the kernel, you must break the shell." This is the perennial philosophy, expressed in different languages across cultures and centuries. True growth is a process of unveiling rather than building, discovering rather than constructing, remembering rather than learning something new. Plato believed that all knowledge was actually recollection, that learning was remembering what the soul already knew but had forgotten in the trauma of birth into the material world. What makes this so difficult to accept in our modern context is that we've been marinated in a culture of accumulation. Capitalism teaches that more is better. Education teaches that knowledge accumulates. Self-help teaches that you can add tools and techniques to fix yourself. We're trained to see progress as addition, success as accumulation, growth as expansion. The possibility that real transformation might require subtraction, that wisdom might involve unlearning, that wholeness might mean becoming less, not more. This runs counter to everything we've absorbed about how change works. And yet, look at what all wisdom traditions actually describe. The mystic's dark night of the soul isn't about gaining something, but about losing everything false until only truth remains. The hero's journey isn't about accumulating powers, but about dying and being reborn. The philosopher's examined life isn't about collecting more beliefs, but about questioning and discarding false ones. The saint's path isn't about becoming holier, but about removing the obstacles to the divine that's already present. The question these philosophers pose isn't, "What should I become?" but, "What am I beneath what I've become?" It's not, "How do I improve myself?" but "Who am I when I stop trying to improve?" These are radically different questions, and they lead to radically different paths. One path leads to exhaustion, fragmentation, and the accumulation of personas. The other leads to integration, authenticity, and the recovery of what was always there, waiting beneath the surface to be rediscovered. So, what does this actually look like in practice? How do you begin the process of removing what's false when you're not even sure what's false and what's real anymore? It begins with noticing. You start paying attention to the moments when you feel most and least like yourself. This sounds simple, but it requires a kind of vigilance most of us never develop. We're so habituated to performing, to being what the situation requires, that we've lost the ability to distinguish between genuine response and automatic role playing. You might notice it first as exhaustion, not the ordinary tiredness that comes from physical exertion, but a deep, soul-level fatigue that doesn't improve with rest. This exhaustion often signals that you're spending enormous energy maintaining a persona that doesn't fit. The mask is heavy, pretending is exhausting. Your fatigue might be your psyche's way of saying, "I can't hold this up anymore." Pay attention to what you do when no one's watching. Not the lazy or shameful things, those can be their own kind of rebellion performance, but the activities you drift toward when you're not trying to be impressive or productive or good. The music you listen to in private, the thoughts you have on long drives, the way you move through your home when you're alone. These unguarded moments are clues to what lies beneath the constructed self. Notice what angers you disproportionately in others. Jung taught us that what we can't stand in others is often what we've repressed in ourselves. The person whose selfishness infuriates you might be triggering your own disowned selfishness, the healthy self, interest you had to exile to become acceptably selfless. The person whose intensity bothers you might be reflecting your own repressed passion. Your strong reactions are signposts pointing toward shadow material. Watch what you judge. Every "I would never" is likely protecting a persona. Every "I'm not the kind of person who" is maintaining a boundary that might be arbitrary. Every "that's not who I am" might be more accurately stated as "that's not who I've decided to appear to be." The things you most insist you're not are often things you're working hard to keep repressed. Begin questioning your automatic responses. When someone asks how you are and you say fine, is that true or is it trained? When you respond to a situation in a habitual way, is that genuine or is it the persona responding? When you make a choice, whose voice are you hearing in your head? Yours, or the internalized voices of parents, teachers, culture, the expectations you've absorbed and mistake for your own desires? This is where the work becomes uncomfortable, because as you start noticing the gaps between your authentic responses and your performed responses, you'll face a choice. You can ignore the gap, plaster over it, return to unconsciousness, or you can begin, carefully and courageously, to act from the authentic place instead of the performed one. This doesn't mean becoming reckless or impulsive. Shadow integration isn't about suddenly acting out everything you've repressed. It's about acknowledging these parts of yourself, making space for them internally, and finding appropriate ways to honor them. Maybe you don't quit your job and move to Bali, but you do acknowledge that your craving for adventure is real and find ways to feed it. Maybe you don't blow up your marriage, but you do admit that your relational needs aren't being met and begin honest conversations about them. The process involves what Jung called active imagination, a creating space to dialogue with the parts of yourself you've been ignoring. This might look like journaling from the perspective of the part of you that wants to quit everything. It might look like paying attention to your dreams and the messages they're sending from the unconscious. It might look like sitting with uncomfortable emotions instead of immediately trying to fix or suppress them. You'll encounter resistance. The persona doesn't want to be dismantled. It was built for protection. The ego doesn't want to discover it's not in charge. The comfortable life you've constructed will feel threatened. You might face periods of intense anxiety as the structures you've relied on begin to loosen. This is normal. This is necessary. The anxiety is signaling that you're touching something real. Other people might resist too. When you start showing up differently, when you stop playing your assigned role in their lives, they may feel uncomfortable. The people who have known you as one thing might struggle when you begin being another. Some relationships will deepen through this honesty. Others might not survive it. This is painful, but often unavoidable. Growth toward authenticity sometimes means outgrowing contexts that require your inauthenticity. What does integration actually look like? It looks like feeling more alive and more uncertain at the same time. It looks like being less sure of who you are while feeling more genuinely yourself. It looks like caring less about some things you thought mattered and caring more deeply about things you'd been ignoring. It looks like surprising yourself, discovering capacities and interests you didn't know you had because they'd been buried beneath shoulds and supposed tos. You'll notice you have more energy because you're not burning it all in repression. You'll find you're less reactive because you're not constantly triggered by your own shadow. You'll discover a kind of groundedness that comes from standing on your own foundation rather than on borrowed beliefs and inherited expectations. You'll feel more integrated, not split between the person you are in public and the person you are in private, but more consistent across contexts, because that consistency comes from within rather than from performing appropriate roles. The work never ends, really. Individuation isn't a destination, but a direction. You don't arrive at complete authenticity and plant a flag. You continue noticing, questioning, peeling away layers, discovering new dimensions of yourself that were hidden. But the quality of the journey changes. Instead of climbing toward some idealized future self, you're excavating toward your actual self. Instead of becoming more, you're becoming more real. There's a moment in this process that's impossible to predict or force. The moment when something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. You're still you, still carrying your history and your wounds and your circumstances. But you're standing in a different relationship to all of it. The transformation doesn't look like the movies. There's no montage, no sudden realization that solves everything, no dramatic rebirth into a perfected version of yourself. Instead, it's more like waking up slowly. You notice that certain things that used to bother you don't anymore, not because you've conquered them, but because they're not about you in the way you thought they were. You notice you're making different choices without trying to make different choices. You're showing up differently because you're being different, not performing different. People might comment that you seem lighter, more present, more real. Or they might say you seem different in ways they can't quite name. You're not performing happiness or confidence or wisdom. You're simply less burdened by the weight of all you're not pretending to be. There's a groundedness that comes from standing on actual ground rather than on the shaky platform of a constructed identity. What strikes you most is the paradox. You've become less sure of yourself, in some ways less certain of your narratives, less convinced of yourself, concepts, less defended about your positions. But you feel more stable, more solid, more authentically you. The certainty you've released was false certainty, the confidence of the persona. What's emerged is something quieter but more genuine, and not the performance of knowing who you are, but the lived experience of being who you are. The relationships in your life have likely shifted. Some have deepened beyond what you thought possible, moving from surface-level interaction to genuine meeting. Others have fallen away, and while there's grief in that, there's also relief. You're no longer maintaining connections that required your inauthenticity to survive. The people who remain are relating to you, not to your persona, and this creates a kind of intimacy that the performed self could never access. You notice you're less reactive. When someone criticizes you, there's still a sting, but it doesn't devastate you the way it once might have, because you're not as identified with the image they're criticizing. When someone praises you, it feels good, but it doesn't define you. You're less desperate for approval because you're not performing for approval. The opinions of others become just that, opinions, data points, perspectives, rather than verdicts on your worth. The shadow hasn't disappeared. You still have parts of yourself that are difficult, uncomfortable, inconvenient. But they're no longer exiled. They're acknowledged, integrated to varying degrees, given room at the table of your psyche. This doesn't mean you act out every impulse, but it does mean you're not at war with yourself. The energy that went into repression is now available for living. You discover that authenticity isn't comfortable, it's alive. Being genuinely yourself means feeling more, not less. Means being more vulnerable, not more protected. Means acknowledging uncertainty rather than pretending to have it all figured out. But this aliveness, this vulnerability, This uncertainty feels more right than the deadness of pretending ever did. There's a grief that accompanies this transformation. Grief for the years spent being someone you weren't. Grief for the unlived life, the roads not taken, the self you might have been if you'd started this process earlier. But even this grief is clean, honest, real. It's not the numb depression of the performed life, but the sharp sadness of genuine loss. And somehow, even the grief feels more alive than the numbness did. You also discover that removing the false doesn't reveal perfection underneath. What you find is human, flawed, complex, contradictory. You're not a marble sculpture waiting to be revealed. You're more like a living tree that's been trying to grow while wrapped in wires and concrete. When you remove the constraints, you don't suddenly become ideal. You become natural, which is both more beautiful and more imperfect than you imagined. The process continues. There are deeper layers, older wounds, more subtle forms of falseness. But you've learned how to do this work now. You've learned to notice, to question, to sit with discomfort, to choose authenticity even when it's costly. You've learned that growth isn't about acquiring new parts, but about releasing old constraints. And this knowing changes everything. Remember that moment we started with standing in front of the mirror, wondering when you stopped recognizing yourself. If you've done this work, that moment transforms. You're still standing in front of the mirror, but now you're meeting your own eyes. Not judging, not performing, not adjusting yourself to match some external image. Just looking, just being looked at. Just present with what actually is. The great paradox of this journey is that in removing what's false, you don't arrive at some pristine, perfect, true self. You arrive at something far more interesting. You arrive at a self that's alive, evolving, capable of genuine response rather than programmed reaction. You discover that authenticity isn't a destination but a practice, not a state of being but a way of being. Growth isn't about adding more tools to your psychological toolkit, more achievements to your resume, more identities to try on. It's about the courage to remove what never fit, to question what you've never questioned, to release what you've been carrying that was never yours to carry. It's about excavation, revelation, uncovering. It's about the sculpture that emerges when you chip away everything that isn't you. Jung knew this, the philosophers knew this, the mystics knew this, and somewhere beneath all the layers of who you've tried to be, you know this too. You've always known it. That's what the exhaustion has been telling you. That's what the quiet moments of disconnection have been revealing. That's what your own psyche has been trying to communicate through anxiety and depression and the vague sense that something isn't right. The invitation isn't to become better or to achieve more. The invitation is to become real, to allow what's false to fall away, to discover what remains when you stop pretending, and what remains, messy, imperfect, gloriously alive, is far more interesting than anything you could have constructed. This is the work of a lifetime, not because it takes a lifetime to complete, but because it's a direction rather than a destination, a practice rather than a goal. You don't finish individuating any more than you finish growing or finish being alive. You continue, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment, choosing authenticity over performance, presence over pretending, truth over comfort. And in that choosing, in that continual removing of what's false, you discover something unexpected. You discover that who you actually are is enough. Not perfect, not complete, not ideal, but real, and real, it turns out, is what you've been hungry for all along. Real is what the world needs from you. Real is where life actually happens, where connection actually occurs, where meaning actually emerges. So perhaps the question isn't, who should I become? Perhaps the question is, what can I let go of? What mask can you set down? What performance can you stop giving? What expectation can you release? What false self can you allow to die so that something truer can emerge? The answer is already in you, has always been in you, is waiting beneath the layers to be discovered. Not by adding more, not by becoming better, but by having the courage to remove what was never truly you in the first place. That's where the real work begins. That's where the real life begins. That's where you begin.